I took a job last summer working alone on an old farm in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much money, but I needed work, and the man who owned it didn't care about my past or ask questions. He just told me to keep the fields in shape, make sure the animals were fed, and stay through harvest season. The place was miles from town, surrounded by dry land and long dirt roads that all looked the same. The farmhouse sat near a slope, with a few barns scattered behind it. The farthest field stretched out past a broken wooden fence, and that was where the old well was. It was half buried in weeds, covered with a rusted metal lid, and surrounded by cracked earth. The first week was simple. I worked from sunrise to sundown. The heat was heavy, and the air was filled with the smell of dry grass, manure, and old wood baking under the sun. The farm was quiet most days, just the buzzing of insects, the low groans of the barn in the wind, and the distant creak of a windmill that hadn't turned right in years. I didn't mind the silence. After a while, I got used to the rhythm of it, the way everything slowed down out there, the way time felt different when there wasn't anyone around. The first time I noticed something strange, it was near the back field. I'd been clearing tall weeds along the fence line when I saw fresh tire tracks leading toward the old well. The owner hadn't mentioned anyone else coming out there, and I hadn't seen another vehicle all week. The tracks were deep, like something heavy had been parked there recently. I walked over to the well. The metal lid was pushed slightly to the side. It looked like someone had tried to lift it, then left it halfway open. I didn't want to mess with it, so I nudged it back in place with a stick and went back to work. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room was in the attic above the kitchen, small and stuffy, with one window that faced the fields. The moon was bright enough to light up the land in a pale silver glow. From my window, I could see the fence line, the barns, and the faint outline of the well at the far end. Around midnight, I noticed something moving near it. A small shape, dark and quick, like someone crouching down. I stared for a long time, trying to figure out what it was, but it stayed too far away to tell. Eventually, I closed the curtain and tried to ignore it. The next morning, I went out there again. The dirt around the well was disturbed, footprints leading in and out from the same spot I'd seen the night before. I crouched down and noticed small pieces of fabric caught on the metal edge of the lid. It looked like part of a sleeve. I didn't touch it. The air around the well felt colder than the rest of the field, which didn't make sense under that kind of sun. I walked back to the barn, trying not to think too much about it, but the image of those footprints stuck in my head all day. The days after that felt heavier. I couldn't explain it, but the whole place started to feel off. The animals were restless. The cows that usually stayed near the fence stopped grazing there. They'd keep to the far end of the pasture, staring toward the back field but never crossing it. One morning, I found one of the sheep tangled in the fence wire near that same area. The poor thing had struggled so much it had cut itself badly. The ground around it was torn up, as if it had been trying to get away from something before it got caught. That night, I woke up again around the same time. There was a sound this time. A dull metal clank, faint but steady, like someone lifting and dropping the lid of the well. The sound echoed faintly across the fields, carried by the wind. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, staring through the window. The well was barely visible, just a dark shape against the lighter ground. I told myself it could have been an animal, or maybe the lid had come loose again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. The next day, I brought my flashlight and went out to check it before sunset. The ground around the well looked worse now, like it had been dug up. The lid had been moved completely to the side, and a rope hung down into the darkness. The rope was new. The fibers were clean, not weathered like the old rusted metal. It went straight down into the black hole of the well, too far to see the end. I shined my flashlight down, but the beam faded before it reached the bottom. I dropped a small rock, waited to hear it hit water, but it just kept going. No splash, no sound, just silence. I should have covered it again, but something made me step closer. I leaned over slightly, careful not to slip, and that's when I caught the smell. It was faint at first, damp, like old mud, but underneath it was something else, something sour and rotten. I pulled back quickly. My hands were shaking. I set the lid back over the hole, pressed it down as best I could, and walked back toward the farmhouse. That night, the sound came back louder. It wasn't just metal this time, it was movement. I could hear footsteps crunching in the dirt outside, slow and dragging. I didn't move from my bed. My window was open a little, and I could hear the faint sound of something shifting near the barn. It went on for almost an hour. Every time I thought it had stopped, I'd hear another scrape or a dull thump. When it finally went quiet, I sat there in the dark until morning. I went outside as soon as the sun came up. The ground near the barn had more of those strange footprints, bare, wide, uneven. They led back toward the well again. I followed them, heart racing. When I got there, the lid was off once more, lying several feet away. The rope was gone this time. I stared down into the hole. The smell hit me harder now. Thick, rotten, and sweet, like something dead had been sitting in water for too long. My stomach turned and I stepped back. I wanted to leave that instant, but I still had work to do, and I didn't want to lose the pay I'd been promised. That afternoon, I decided to take one last look before calling the job quits. I brought the flashlight, tied a long piece of rope around a nearby fence post, and lowered it down slowly to see how deep the well really was. I let the light drop a few feet, then a few more. Still no bottom. The smell grew stronger the farther it went. Then I felt a tug on the rope. Not a slip, not the weight of the flashlight hitting something, but a slow, steady pull from below. I froze. The rope moved again, harder this time, and the light vanished into the dark. I pulled it back fast, my hands burning from the friction, but the end came up clean, cut straight through. The flashlight was gone. I dropped the rope and stepped back, my legs shaking so bad I could barely stand. I didn't stay another minute. I ran straight to the house, grabbed my things, and drove down the dirt road until the farm was nothing but a blur in my rearview mirror. A few days later, I called the owner from a payphone and told him I couldn't finish the job. He didn't ask why. He just said fine and hung up. I didn't mention the well. I didn't tell him about the smell, the tracks, or the rope. I just wanted to forget it. But about 2 weeks later, I saw something on the local news while eating at a diner. A reporter was standing near that same farm. They said a man had gone missing after working out there, and the sheriff's office had found the old well uncovered with evidence of animal remains and something else, unidentified. They were still investigating. The camera panned across the fields, and for a split second, I saw the well behind the reporter. The lid was off again, just lying there, tilted in the dirt like someone had moved it only moments before. I never went back to that town. I don't even drive through that part of the state anymore. But sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place and there's no wind, I swear I can hear that sound again. The dull metal clank echoing faintly, like something down below is still trying to climb its way out. And I can still smell it sometimes too. That same sour, rotting scent that never really leaves your memory once you've breathed it in. It was late summer when I took the job helping out on a farm a few miles outside a small town I barely knew. The man who owned it was older, quiet, and didn't care much for company. He just needed someone to fix fences, feed animals, and keep the place running while he handled business in town. I didn't mind the solitude. I'd always liked open fields and long, silent days. The farm was about 80 acres of corn, wheat, and a few small barns, with a line of old silos standing behind everything. Only one was still in use. The others looked abandoned, their metal rusted, their ladders broken, and the ground around them covered in weeds and cracked concrete. The first few days went smoothly. I worked from sunrise to sunset, feeding the pigs, mending broken boards in the barn, and spraying weeds along the fences. The air was dry, and the field stretched so far out that it almost felt like the horizon bent around me. There was a constant hum of insects, the smell of dirt and diesel, and the faint creak of metal from the old windmill behind the main barn. The nights were quiet too quiet sometimes. I slept in a small room above the tool shed. It had one window that looked out toward the silos. When the wind blew, the loose metal sheets on the farthest silo would rattle, making this hollow, clanging sound that echoed across the yard. It was annoying at first, but after a while I got used to it. Around the 5th day, I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. Tools I left leaning against the fence would be gone in the morning. A feed bucket I used one evening ended up on the opposite side of the barn the next day. I figured I'd just misplaced them. When you're working alone all day, your mind wanders, and you don't always remember where you leave things. But then I noticed the cornfield near the back fence. There were narrow trails cut into the rows, like something had walked through them at night. They weren't tractor marks or animal paths. They were too straight, too clean, as if someone had been walking through the crops in the dark. That part of the farm was close to the old silos. I didn't go there often because there wasn't much to do out that way. The ground was uneven, and tall weeds had grown up around the structures. The first time I went out there, it was just to see where the trails led. The corn was tall and dry, brushing against my arms as I pushed through. The air felt heavy, almost still, even though the wind was moving the tops of the stalks. The trail ran straight toward the back silo, the one that leaned slightly like it might fall someday. The metal door at the base was half buried in dirt and hard to move, but I managed to pull it open enough to peek inside. It was dark in there. The smell hit me first, stale, like wet grain mixed with rot. I shined my flashlight inside and saw a pile of old corn husks, a few broken boards, and what looked like animal nests built against the walls. Nothing unusual. I backed out and closed the door again, figuring maybe some raccoons had been living in there. I didn't think about it much after that. A few nights later, I woke up around midnight. There was a dull metallic sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against a loose gate, but it kept repeating in a rhythm, slow, scraping, and hollow. I got up, went to the window, and looked out toward the silos. The moonlight was dim, but I could see movement. Something or someone was near that same old silo, a dark shape against the metal. I stood there for a while, trying to focus, but it was too far to see clearly. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. The next morning, I walked back out there. The ground around the silo had more tracks now. Not footprints exactly, but spots where the grass and weeds had been flattened in strange patterns. I also noticed that the door I'd left shut was slightly open again. I thought maybe the wind had done it, but the thing was heavy. I had to use both hands to close it before. I pulled it shut again, made sure it was tight, and went back to work. That day felt longer than usual. I couldn't shake the thought of what I'd seen the night before. Every time I turned toward the fields, I found myself glancing at the silo. I kept imagining that maybe someone was living out there. The place was isolated, miles from any other farm. It wouldn't be impossible for someone to hide out without being noticed. I didn't tell anyone, though. I figured I'd just keep an eye on it myself. That night, the noise came back, louder this time. A scraping metal sound followed by a heavy thud, like something falling inside the silo. I sat up, listening. My chest felt tight. The window was open a crack, and I could hear the faint echo of the sound carried through the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside. The ground was cool under my boots, and the air smelled of dry hay and diesel. Every sound felt sharper. The crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of machinery. When I reached the silo, everything was still. The metal door was half open again, swinging slowly. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, showing dust floating in the air. I called out but got no response. I stepped closer, holding the light steady. Inside, I saw the same pile of old husks, but they looked disturbed this time, as if something had been digging or moving through them. The dirt floor had deep marks, like something heavy had been dragged. I stepped inside just far enough to see the back wall. There was a hole there, small at first glance, but deeper than it looked. It wasn't natural. The dirt had been dug out carefully, forming a narrow tunnel that sloped downward. The smell was stronger near it, a mix of damp soil and something foul, like rotting meat. I felt my stomach turn. I didn't go any closer. I backed out slowly and shut the door again, this time pushing a broken board through the handle to wedge it shut. The next morning, I found the board lying on the ground. The door was open again. The marks in the dirt were fresher, and the tunnel looked wider. I didn't want to admit it, but something or someone was definitely using that space. I spent the rest of the day keeping busy near the barn, trying not to think about it. I even thought about leaving, but I'd been promised a full month's pay, and I needed the money. I told myself I'd just stay out of the back field and finish my work. But that night, I woke up again to noise. Different this time. Not metal or scraping, but something moving fast across the yard. I heard grain spilling, a low thump, then silence. I turned on my flashlight and looked out. The barn door was open. I felt my throat tighten. I climbed down from my room, trying to move quietly, and walked toward the barn. My boots crunched on gravel, and my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my neck. The flashlight beam hit the barn door. The hinges were bent, the bottom corner cracked. Inside, the feed sacks had been ripped open. The grain was scattered everywhere. Near the corner where the sacks had been stacked, there were fresh drag marks again, leading out the back toward the same direction, the silos. I followed the trail with my light, my hands shaking. The marks went straight through the weeds to the same silo door. When I reached it, it was open all the way this time, as if waiting. I shined the light inside. The tunnel was bigger now, easily wide enough for a person to crawl through. The smell made me gag. I saw something at the edge of the hole, cloth, torn and dirty. It looked like part of a shirt. I didn't want to touch it. The edges were dark and stiff. That was enough for me. I turned around and went straight to the main house. The owner had left a small shotgun there for coyotes. I took it, loaded it, and waited until sunrise sitting on the porch, staring toward the fields. In the morning, I packed my things. I didn't go near the silo again. When the owner came back a week later, I was long gone. I never told him what I'd seen or heard. I didn't want to explain it, and I didn't want to know more. But about a month later, I saw a short news article online. It mentioned that local police had found human remains buried under an old silo outside town. They said it looked like the person had been living underground for years, maybe even decades. The name of the farm wasn't listed, but I knew it was the same place. Every now and then, I think about that tunnel, about the nights I heard movement out there while I was sleeping just a few hundred yards away. I still remember the smell, the sound of metal shifting in the dark, and that half-open door swinging in the wind. I never went back, and I never will. Even now, when I pass wide-open fields and see old silos leaning against the sky, I look away, because I know some places don't forget what's been buried beneath them. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, on a farm that had been in my family for generations. It sat on flat land, surrounded by long rows of cornfields that stretched so far you could see the earth curve on a clear day. The farm wasn't big or fancy, just a couple of barns, a tractor shed, a small pond, and an old two-story house that creaked every time the wind blew. My father passed away when I was 19, and after that, it was just me running the place. The land was good for corn. Every year we planted early in spring, and by midsummer, the fields stood tall and full. But there was always one section that never grew right. It was a patch near the back, maybe the size of a basketball court, where the corn never rose higher than my knee. The soil looked no different from the rest, but the plants came out yellow and brittle. My father used to call it the dead patch. He said his father had tried to fix it a dozen times with fertilizer, new soil, everything. Nothing ever changed. For years, I left it alone. I just worked around it. But in the summer of 2017, I decided to finally do something about it. The rest of the farm was struggling that year, the rain came late and prices were low. I couldn't afford to waste even a small patch of land. So I made up my mind to dig it up, see what was wrong underneath. It was early July when I started. The air was thick and hot, the kind that makes the back of your neck stay damp all day. I brought out a shovel and started digging at the edge of the patch. The dirt was dry on top, but a few inches down it turned darker and heavy, like wet clay. I figured that might be the problem, poor drainage. I kept going deeper, trying to see how far it went. After about a foot down, the shovel hit something solid. At first, I thought it was a rock, but when I cleared some of the dirt away, I saw it was flat, metal. I knelt down and brushed it with my hand. It looked like an old piece of sheet metal, rusty and rough. It was wider than the hole I dug, so I cleared more space around it. The edges were straight, almost like a lid. The strange thing was that it didn't belong there. We didn't bury anything in the fields, and the shape didn't look like farming equipment. I scraped off more dirt until I found a seam along one side, like where it had been welded or attached to something. I should have stopped right there, but curiosity gets you, especially when you've worked the same land your whole life and think you know every inch of it. I went back to the shed, grabbed a crowbar, and pried under one edge. The metal groaned when I lifted it, breaking free with a sharp snap. When I looked underneath, I froze. There was a hollow space beneath the ground, a square pit about 6 feet deep, with wooden walls that looked old and damp. The smell hit me right away, thick, musty, like wet soil mixed with rot. The bottom was dark, hard to see clearly at first, but the longer I looked, the more I realized something was down there. I lowered the flashlight from my pocket into the hole. The beam cut through the shadows, and my stomach turned. At the bottom, there were old burlap sacks piled together, stained dark and half buried in the mud. The smell was unbearable now, thick enough to make me gag. I stood there a long time, staring into that pit, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look like garbage. The sacks were too neatly arranged, and the wood lining the pit looked deliberate, almost like a box built into the earth. The longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. I told myself I just stumbled on an old storage hole, maybe something my grandfather had built decades ago and forgotten about. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark hole again. The way the air coming from it felt heavy, like it was breathing out old air that had been trapped for years. I thought about going out to cover it up, but I didn't want to get near it again in the dark. The next morning, I went back out, telling myself I'd dig it up properly and see what was inside. The first thing I noticed was that the lid was gone. The metal sheet I'd pried loose was lying a few feet away from where I'd left it. The wind couldn't have moved it, it was too heavy. When I leaned over the edge, the sacks were still there, but they looked disturbed, shifted slightly, like something had been moved around. The smell was worse now, sour and sharp. Flies buzzed above it. I pulled my shirt over my nose and used the shovel to hook one of the bags. The fabric tore easily, spilling out what was inside. I expected dirt or grain, but instead out rolled small, pale shapes. Bones. I froze, staring at them. They were small, too small to be livestock. My brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing, but there was no mistaking it. Human bones. I dropped the shovel and stumbled backward. I couldn't stop staring. There were at least a dozen sacks down there. Some looked newer, some older. The dirt around them was black and wet. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up the flashlight again. I went straight back to the house and sat there for hours, staring at the floor. The thought kept looping in my head. Those weren't animal bones. When I finally got the nerve to go back outside, the sun was setting. The light stretched long and red across the fields. I could see the patch of dirt from my porch, a darker square against the rest of the corn. I didn't want to go near it again, but I couldn't ignore it either. I walked back slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached it, the smell was almost gone. That struck me as strange. It had been choking before. The hole looked different too. The dirt around the edges was disturbed, like it had been filled in partially. The sacks were gone. Every single one. There was nothing in the hole but mud. I stared for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. The wood lining was still there, but the bottom was smooth, empty. The air coming out of it was still warm, faintly damp, like breath. I filled it back in before it got dark. I didn't think. I just shoveled until the hole was gone, until it looked like the rest of the field. Then I covered it with loose soil and packed it flat with my boots. I told myself it was done, buried again, whatever it had been. That night, I locked the doors and sat by the window until dawn. The wind picked up after midnight, making the old walls groan. I thought I could hear faint noises coming from the fields, soft scraping sounds like dirt being moved, but maybe that was just the wind through the dry corn. The next morning, I walked out to the patch again. The dirt looked freshly turned. In the middle of it, right where the hole had been, the soil was sunken a few inches, like something underneath had settled overnight. I left it alone after that. I didn't dig, I didn't plant, I didn't even step near that area again. By the next season, weeds had started growing over it, and I let them. The rest of the field grew fine, tall, and green, but that spot stayed the same. Uneven, sunken, and bare. Months later, during the fall harvest, a heavy rain came through and washed part of the field. When I went out to check the damage, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The water had cut through the edge of that patch, revealing part of what I'd buried. The top of a wooden board was showing, and under it, just barely visible through the thin layer of mud, was the corner of another burlap sack. I didn't dig it out. Couldn't. I just stared at it for a long time before covering it again with dirt. It's been years now. The farm still stands, but I sold it last spring. I told the new owners the soil in that back corner was bad for planting. They didn't ask questions. Sometimes I think about calling someone, telling them what I found, but then I think about how the ground moved on its own, how the smell disappeared overnight, how those sacks vanished like they were never there. I don't want to know what's still buried under that soil, or what was taken out before I filled it back in. When I drive past that old road now, I can still see the silo and the house in the distance, but I never look toward the back fields. I know exactly where that patch lies, even from miles away, the one spot where nothing ever grows right. And deep down, I know it's not because of the soil. I used to work part-time on a small farm outside a town called Haverhill. It was quiet, surrounded by flat fields that stretched out for miles, with a few scattered barns and an old grain silo that stood taller than anything else in sight. The owner, a man named Duncan, had inherited the place from his father, but most of the work fell on me and one other laborer. I lived in a small trailer behind the barn during the harvest season, so I was there all the time, even at night when everything went still. Most nights on a farm are peaceful. You get used to the hum of crickets, the wind moving through the grass, and the soft creaking of old wood. But there's also a kind of loneliness that comes with it. Once the sun sets, the world feels empty. You can stand outside and not see a single light except for the stars. It's quiet in a way that makes you notice every small sound. The farm had an old grain silo that hadn't been used properly in years. It stood behind the barn, a tall rusted cylinder with a dented top and a hatch that never seemed to close right. The ladder running up the side was half broken, and the inside smelled of mold and old corn dust. Duncan said it wasn't worth fixing, so it just sat there, empty and unused. But even though it was supposed to be empty, I sometimes heard things from inside it. Small noises at first, soft scraping, faint clunks like metal against metal. I thought maybe it was birds nesting inside, or rats climbing through the leftover grain at the bottom. It never really bothered me until that one night in September. That evening, I was finishing up late. The sun had already set, and the last of the light was fading from the sky. The air felt heavy, like rain might come, but the wind had gone still. I'd been cleaning out a feed trough near the barn when I heard something that made me stop. A dull, deep sound, like something sliding down the inside of the silo. It wasn't quick. It was slow and gritty, like dry corn shifting under weight, but the silo had been empty for years. I walked around the side of it and looked up. The hatch at the top was closed, but the little door near the base was slightly open. It creaked as the wind pushed it, though there wasn't much wind at all. I told myself it was probably rats or a raccoon stuck in there. I didn't like the idea of them nesting in it, though, because sometimes they chewed through the wiring or tore up insulation. I decided to check it out in the morning when there was daylight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard another sound outside, something metallic and hollow, echoing from the direction of the silo. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my trailer, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound kept coming, steady and rhythmic, like something scraping along the inside walls. Every few seconds, it stopped, then started again. It wasn't wind. I'd heard wind inside metal before. This had weight behind it. After half an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on a jacket, and went outside. The air was cool and damp, and the sky was moonless. The only light came from my flashlight beam, cutting through the dark. As I got closer to the silo, I noticed the smell first. A strong, rotten odor, like wet corn mixed with something sour. It grew stronger near the door. When I shined the light on it, I saw the door was open wider than before. I knew for sure I'd seen it closed that evening. I crouched and looked inside. The beam caught the curved metal walls, dust hanging thick in the air, but nothing moved. The ground was covered in a thin layer of old grain husks. I stepped closer, and the crunch under my boots echoed up into the hollow space above me. It sounded like there was a lot more room inside than I remembered. I swept the light around slowly, trying to see if any animals were hiding in there. I didn't see anything alive, just scattered bits of corn and a few old tools lying in the corner. I was about to leave when I noticed something odd near the center of the floor. The grain there wasn't flat. It was shaped into a shallow mound, like something was buried underneath. I walked over to it and kicked at it lightly. The mound felt firm. I thought maybe a pile of old feed bags or metal scraps had been left there and covered with dust. I brushed some of it away with my boot. That's when I saw something sticking out of the side of the mound. It was small, dark, and flat. Looked like a piece of rubber or leather. When I bent down to get a closer look, I realized it wasn't rubber at all. It was a piece of fabric, part of an old work glove. My stomach tightened when I saw the shape of fingers inside it. I stepped back fast, my light shaking in my hand. For a second, I told myself it had to be a glove stuffed with something, but I knew it wasn't. The fabric was stretched over something solid. I didn't want to dig any further, but I couldn't stop staring at it. I used a shovel that was leaning near the wall to scrape some of the dust away. More of the mound came loose, and underneath it was something pale. My throat went dry. It was skin, grayish, stretched tight over what looked like a wrist. I backed out of the silo so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my chest might burst. I didn't look back as I ran toward the house, but as I got a few yards away, I heard a dull sound behind me, like the grain shifting again, sliding slowly across the metal floor. I didn't go back in. I stayed in my trailer the rest of the night, every light on, staring out the window at that dark shape of the silo against the sky. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I waited until the sun was up before I went back out. I thought about pretending I'd imagined the whole thing, but I knew I hadn't. The door of the silo was open wider now, swinging slowly back and forth. I stood there a long time before I went inside again. The smell was stronger in daylight, thick and sour, enough to make me gag. The mound in the center was different too. It looked smaller, like something had been pulled down deeper into the floor during the night. I used the shovel to dig again, but the more I moved, the worse the smell got. My hands were shaking. After a few minutes, I hit something solid, a wooden plank. I brushed the dust off and realized the floor wasn't metal at all in that spot. It was covered with old boards, rotted and soft. I jabbed the shovel at one of them, and it broke easily, revealing a hollow space beneath. When I shined my light inside, I saw a dark pit filled with old grain and something else. It looked like cloth, rope, and pale shapes that made my blood run cold. I dropped the shovel and stumbled out, barely able to breathe. My head spun. I didn't want to look again to be sure of what I'd seen, but I knew what it was. Bodies, or what was left of them. I didn't have a car, and there was no cell service that far out. The farmhouse was locked, and Duncan was still out of town. I ran until I reached the main road, nearly 2 miles away, before I found someone driving by. The police came out later that afternoon. They sealed off the silo and the barn, asked me 100 questions I could barely answer. I told them everything I'd seen. They spent hours digging through the base of that silo. When they finished, the sheriff told me quietly that they'd found 3 bodies buried beneath the grain floor. They'd been there for years. The last farmhand before me had gone missing sometime around 2007, and 2 travelers who'd camped nearby had disappeared around that same time. Nobody had ever connected it to the farm. Duncan was taken in for questioning. I never saw him again after that. They said there wasn't enough to charge him with anything concrete, but I didn't believe that. Someone had gone to the trouble of hiding those bodies in a place no one checked. Someone who knew that silo well. I left that farm the next day. I packed what I had and got a ride back to town. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale shape under the dust, the way the mound seemed to sink like it was swallowing itself. It's been years since then, but I still can't stand the sound of grain shifting in a metal bin. It's too close to that noise I heard that first night. Slow, heavy, like something moving just out of sight. I've worked on other farms since, smaller ones, simpler ones, but I never stay near silos anymore. When I see one, standing tall and quiet against the horizon, it makes me sick to my stomach, because now I know what can be hidden inside them. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, I realize the scariest part wasn't finding what was buried there. It was knowing that for all those nights before, while I slept just a few hundred feet away, something had been moving underneath that grain, quietly settling, shifting, and waiting to be found. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, on a farm that had been in my family for generations. It sat on flat land, surrounded by long rows of cornfields that stretched so far you could see the earth curve on a clear day. The farm wasn't big or fancy, just a couple of barns, a tractor shed, a small pond, and an old two-story house that creaked every time the wind blew. My father passed away when I was 19, and after that, it was just me running the place. The land was good for corn. Every year we planted early in spring, and by midsummer, the fields stood tall and full. But there was always one section that never grew right. It was a patch near the back, maybe the size of a basketball court, where the corn never rose higher than my knee. The soil looked no different from the rest, but the plants came out yellow and brittle. My father used to call it the dead patch. He said his father had tried to fix it a dozen times with fertilizer, new soil, everything. Nothing ever changed. For years, I left it alone. I just worked around it. But in the summer of 2017, I decided to finally do something about it. The rest of the farm was struggling that year, the rain came late and prices were low. I couldn't afford to waste even a small patch of land. So I made up my mind to dig it up, see what was wrong underneath. It was early July when I started. The air was thick and hot, the kind that makes the back of your neck stay damp all day. I brought out a shovel and started digging at the edge of the patch. The dirt was dry on top, but a few inches down it turned darker and heavy, like wet clay. I figured that might be the problem, poor drainage. I kept going deeper, trying to see how far it went. After about a foot down, the shovel hit something solid. At first, I thought it was a rock, but when I cleared some of the dirt away, I saw it was flat, metal. I knelt down and brushed it with my hand. It looked like an old piece of sheet metal, rusty and rough. It was wider than the hole I dug, so I cleared more space around it. The edges were straight, almost like a lid. The strange thing was that it didn't belong there. We didn't bury anything in the fields, and the shape didn't look like farming equipment. I scraped off more dirt until I found a seam along one side, like where it had been welded or attached to something. I should have stopped right there, but curiosity gets you, especially when you've worked the same land your whole life and think you know every inch of it. I went back to the shed, grabbed a crowbar, and pried under one edge. The metal groaned when I lifted it, breaking free with a sharp snap. When I looked underneath, I froze. There was a hollow space beneath the ground, a square pit about 6 feet deep, with wooden walls that looked old and damp. The smell hit me right away, thick, musty, like wet soil mixed with rot. The bottom was dark, hard to see clearly at first, but the longer I looked, the more I realized something was down there. I lowered the flashlight from my pocket into the hole. The beam cut through the shadows, and my stomach turned. At the bottom, there were old burlap sacks piled together, stained dark and half buried in the mud. The smell was unbearable now, thick enough to make me gag. I stood there a long time, staring into that pit, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look like garbage. The sacks were too neatly arranged, and the wood lining the pit looked deliberate, almost like a box built into the earth. The longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. I told myself I just stumbled on an old storage hole, maybe something my grandfather had built decades ago and forgotten about. But deep down, I didn't believe that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark hole again. The way the air coming from it felt heavy, like it was breathing out old air that had been trapped for years. I thought about going out to cover it up, but I didn't want to get near it again in the dark. The next morning, I went back out, telling myself I'd dig it up properly and see what was inside. The first thing I noticed was that the lid was gone. The metal sheet I'd pried loose was lying a few feet away from where I'd left it. The wind couldn't have moved it, it was too heavy. When I leaned over the edge, the sacks were still there, but they looked disturbed, shifted slightly, like something had been moved around. The smell was worse now, sour and sharp. Flies buzzed above it. I pulled my shirt over my nose and used the shovel to hook one of the bags. The fabric tore easily, spilling out what was inside. I expected dirt or grain, but instead out rolled small, pale shapes. Bones. I froze, staring at them. They were small, too small to be livestock. My brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing, but there was no mistaking it. Human bones. I dropped the shovel and stumbled backward. I couldn't stop staring. There were at least a dozen sacks down there. Some looked newer, some older. The dirt around them was black and wet. I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up the flashlight again. I went straight back to the house and sat there for hours, staring at the floor. The thought kept looping in my head. Those weren't animal bones. When I finally got the nerve to go back outside, the sun was setting. The light stretched long and red across the fields. I could see the patch of dirt from my porch, a darker square against the rest of the corn. I didn't want to go near it again, but I couldn't ignore it either. I walked back slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached it, the smell was almost gone. That struck me as strange. It had been choking before. The hole looked different too. The dirt around the edges was disturbed, like it had been filled in partially. The sacks were gone. Every single one. There was nothing in the hole but mud. I stared for a long time, trying to understand what I was looking at. The wood lining was still there, but the bottom was smooth, empty. The air coming out of it was still warm, faintly damp, like breath. I filled it back in before it got dark. I didn't think. I just shoveled until the hole was gone, until it looked like the rest of the field. Then I covered it with loose soil and packed it flat with my boots. I told myself it was done, buried again, whatever it had been. That night, I locked the doors and sat by the window until dawn. The wind picked up after midnight, making the old walls groan. I thought I could hear faint noises coming from the fields, soft scraping sounds like dirt being moved, but maybe that was just the wind through the dry corn. The next morning, I walked out to the patch again. The dirt looked freshly turned. In the middle of it, right where the hole had been, the soil was sunken a few inches, like something underneath had settled overnight. I left it alone after that. I didn't dig, I didn't plant, I didn't even step near that area again. By the next season, weeds had started growing over it, and I let them. The rest of the field grew fine, tall and green, but that spot stayed the same. Uneven, sunken, and bare. Months later, during the fall harvest, a heavy rain came through and washed part of the field. When I went out to check the damage, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The water had cut through the edge of that patch, revealing part of what I'd buried. The top of a wooden board was showing, and under it, just barely visible through the thin layer of mud, was the corner of another burlap sack. I didn't dig it out. Couldn't. I just stared at it for a long time before covering it again with dirt. It's been years now. The farm still stands, but I sold it last spring. I told the new owners the soil in that back corner was bad for planting. They didn't ask questions. Sometimes I think about calling someone, telling them what I found, but then I think about how the ground moved on its own, how the smell disappeared overnight, how those sacks vanished like they were never there. I don't want to know what's still buried under that soil, or what was taken out before I filled it back in. When I drive past that old road now, I can still see the silo and the house in the distance, but I never look toward the back fields. I know exactly where that patch lies, even from miles away, the one spot where nothing ever grows right. And deep down, I know it's not because of the soil. I took a job at a remote farm in late October, the kind of place you could drive hours to and still feel like you hadn't gotten anywhere. The owner had passed away, and his son needed someone to watch the land until he could come back and sell it. The pay was decent, and all I had to do was feed the animals, check the fences, and make sure no one trespassed. It sounded simple, and I liked the idea of being away from people for a while. The farm was surrounded by open fields that stretched so far they seemed to disappear into the earth. And beyond that was a dense patch of woods that looked black even during the day. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and the only road in was a long dirt path that cut through the wheat fields like a scar. The house was old, with siding faded gray, windows warped from years of storms, and the roof patched with metal sheets that rattled in the wind. Inside, everything smelled like dust, oil, and old hay. The floors creaked under every step, and the walls were so thin you could hear the wind slide through them. Behind the house stood 2 barns, one for tools and the other for livestock, and a few rusted tractors that hadn't been moved in years. There were cows, a handful of chickens, and a pig pen that was half collapsed. The first few days went fine. I woke up early, fed the animals, checked the water lines, and cleaned out the stalls. It was quiet, too quiet sometimes, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own heartbeat if you stood still long enough. I didn't mind it during the day, but at night, that same quiet turned heavy, pressing against the walls of the house. The darkness outside was endless. No lights from nearby homes, no traffic, nothing but black fields and the sound of wind pushing through the dry grass. The first thing that started bothering me was the smell. I noticed it around the 3rd night. Faint at first, like something spoiled. I thought maybe one of the animals had died. I checked the barns, but everything looked fine. Still, the smell grew stronger every night. It was thick, sour, like a mix of blood and rot. It drifted through the air when the wind blew from the north, which meant it was coming from somewhere near the back field. I waited until daylight to check. The back field was overgrown with weeds and dry corn stalks that hadn't been harvested in years. I walked across it slowly, following the smell. The ground was soft in places, muddy even though it hadn't rained in days. I found the source eventually, a dead calf near the edge of the property line. The carcass was torn open, ribs exposed, and most of the flesh gone. What bothered me most was how cleanly it was eaten. The bones weren't gnawed like a coyote would do. They were cut, sharp, and deliberate. I didn't want to think too much about that. I buried it the best I could and went back to the house. But the image stuck in my head all day. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled hard enough to make the old windows shake. Around midnight, I heard a metallic sound coming from outside, like something scraping against steel. I froze. The sound came again, louder this time, from the direction of the barn. I lay there staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body on edge. Eventually, I forced myself up, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately. The beam from my flashlight cut through the fog that had rolled in, thick and heavy. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. I waited, listening. Then I saw movement near the far barn, a flicker of something slipping into the shadows. My stomach tightened. I thought maybe it was a stray dog, or maybe someone trespassing. I approached slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots sounding too loud in the quiet. When I reached the barn, the smell hit me again, stronger than ever. Inside, it was pitch dark. My light flickered as I stepped through the door. The air was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of decay. I swept the light across the floor and saw something that stopped me cold. In the center of the barn, right where the hay bales used to be stacked, was a pile of bones. Cow bones, pig bones, all mixed together. Some looked old and bleached, others still had bits of flesh clinging to them. They were arranged in a rough heap, like someone had been collecting them. My throat went dry. I turned and walked straight out without looking back. I locked the barn door behind me and went inside the house, checking every lock twice before sitting down on the floor with my back against the wall. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it must have been wild animals dragging remains there. Maybe coyotes, maybe something bigger, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been on the property. I started noticing small things after that. The chicken coop door would be open even though I'd shut it the night before. Tools in the shed moved from where I'd left them. Once, I found one of the cows standing near the fence line, trembling, its leg bleeding from a clean slice like it had been cut by a blade. On the 6th night, the power went out. The entire house went dark in an instant. I lit a lantern and sat by the window, staring into the fields. The wind had stopped completely, and the silence felt unnatural, so still that even the animals weren't making noise. Then I saw movement again, this time near the edge of the wheat field. At first, it looked like shadows shifting, but then I realized it was a person. Tall, thin, moving slowly toward the barn. My heart started pounding. I crouched down below the window and waited. The figure disappeared behind the barn door. I stayed there for almost an hour, too scared to move. Then I heard it. The same scraping metal sound, louder now, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the lantern, stepped outside, and walked toward the barn, every step feeling like a mistake. When I got there, the door was wide open again. Inside, the air was hot and foul. The bones were gone, every single one. The floor was clear except for deep drag marks in the dirt leading toward the back door of the barn that opened into the field. I followed the tracks with the light, and that's when I saw the second barn door, the one that faced the woods, swinging slightly in the wind. There was something hanging from one of the hooks near the door. When I got closer, I realized it was a cow's jawbone, freshly cut, blood still dripping onto the ground. I ran back to the house and locked myself inside. The rest of the night, I sat in the kitchen with the shotgun the owner had left, listening to faint noises outside. I could hear footsteps moving around the porch, slow and steady. Then they stopped right near the window. I could feel my pulse in my neck as I stared at the wall, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like hours, the footsteps faded. When morning came, I walked outside, shaking from exhaustion. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, boot prints, not animal tracks. They led from the porch to the barn, then out toward the woods. I followed them as far as the fence line, but they vanished once they hit the grass. I wanted to leave right then, but the truck wouldn't start. The battery was dead, even though I hadn't used it since the day before. I tried jump-starting it with the generator, but the fuel line was cut clean through. That's when I knew whoever had been out there wasn't some random trespasser. They didn't want me leaving. I stayed inside all day, keeping the shotgun close. The air felt heavy, and even the animals seemed on edge. Near sunset, I heard the cows bawling loudly from the back field. I ran out, heart racing, and found the fence torn open again. One of the cows was lying dead on the ground, throat slit. The rest had scattered into the open field. There were boot prints in the mud again, deep ones like someone had been dragging something heavy. They led back toward the barn, but I didn't follow them. Couldn't. I went back inside, locked every door, and sat by the window until dark. That last night was the worst of my life. The sounds started again after midnight. Footsteps circling the house, scraping along the siding, and then the sound of something hitting the door. Slow, heavy bangs, one after another. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the gun. The banging stopped suddenly, replaced by silence. I sat there in the dark, listening, every sense straining. Then I heard it, the faint creak of the back door opening. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out the front, sprinting across the field toward the road. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached the old dirt path. I kept walking until the sun came up, and a passing truck finally stopped to help me. When the sheriff's office went to the farm later that day, they found the barns empty and the animals gone. They said there were signs that someone had been living there. Food wrappers, blankets, tools scattered around, but no one was ever found. They told me maybe it was squatters, maybe drifters moving through. I never went back to see for myself. Sometimes I still think about that place, about the bones, the footprints, and the way the air felt wrong every night after dark. I wonder who had been out there all that time, living just beyond the fields, watching me through those black windows. What scares me most isn't what I saw, but what I didn't. How close that person must have been, and how easily they could have come inside anytime they wanted. It was late September when I decided to spend a week alone on my uncle's old farm in the middle of nowhere. He had passed away the previous year, and the land had been empty ever since. My family didn't want to sell it just yet, so I thought I'd stay there for a while, clean it up, maybe fix a few things and just be away from everything for a bit. The farm sat miles away from the nearest small town, surrounded by endless fields and a dense patch of woods that bordered the back of the property. There was no phone service, and the electricity lines ran weak. The lights flickered sometimes, and the water pump groaned every time I turned the faucet on. But I didn't mind. It was quiet, peaceful in a way until it wasn't. The first night was uneventful. The house smelled like old wood and dust, the air stale from being shut for so long. I set up my sleeping bag in the living room since the bed upstairs looked like it hadn't been used in years. I remember lying there, listening to the crickets outside and the creaking of the wood frame as the house settled into the cold. It was oddly comforting. But sometime after midnight, I woke up because of a strange rhythmic thumping sound. It was faint, like something bumping against a wall or the floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes or maybe a loose shutter. I ignored it and fell asleep again. The next morning, I walked around to see where the sound might have come from. The barn stood about 200 feet from the house, large and faded red, its roof missing some shingles. The doors were slightly open, swaying a bit in the morning wind. I hadn't noticed that last night. Inside, everything was just as my uncle had left it. A few rusted tools, piles of hay, and the broken remains of an old tractor. The smell of manure still lingered even though the place had been empty for a year. I checked around but saw nothing that could have made that noise. Still, something about that barn made me uneasy. The silence inside it felt different. Too still, too heavy. I spent most of the day cleaning up the porch and throwing away old junk from the shed. Around sunset, I went inside, made some canned soup, and read a bit by lantern light. The night came fast. The temperature dropped sharply, and by 9, it was pitch dark outside. There were no city lights, no passing cars, just blackness beyond the windows. I went to bed early, but the sound came again. This time it was louder. A steady thud, pause, then another. It sounded like something hitting the wall from the outside. I lay there listening, my heart thudding along with it. I waited for it to stop, and after what felt like forever, it did. I eventually forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange near the side of the house where I'd heard the noise. The ground was disturbed, the dirt freshly turned up as if something heavy had been dragged or pressed down into it. I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe an animal had been digging. There were faint impressions in the soil, uneven and deep. Not clear footprints, but patterns that looked unnatural. I tried not to overthink it. This was farmland, after all. Wildlife came through all the time. That day, I went out farther, walking the perimeter of the property. I followed the fence line until I reached the tree line behind the fields. The woods were dense, darker than I expected for midday. I didn't go in far, but I saw signs of old activity. Empty beer cans, a half-collapsed hunting blind, and what looked like a small, half-buried fire pit. Someone had clearly been out there at some point. Maybe trespassers, maybe hunters. That gave me a possible explanation for the noises. Maybe someone was coming around at night. Still, I didn't like the idea of anyone wandering that close to the house. When night came again, I left the porch light on. It was weak and flickered every few seconds, but at least it gave me some comfort. I sat by the window for a while, staring at the barn. It was hard to see clearly in the dark, but I could just make out its shape under the faint moonlight. Everything seemed normal until I noticed the barn door was slightly open again. I could have sworn I had latched it earlier. I grabbed the flashlight, walked outside, and went to close it. The air was colder than before, the kind that burned in your nose when you breathed. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I got closer. Inside the barn, the smell hit me first. A sharp, foul stench that made me gag. Something was rotting. I scanned the beam across the floor and saw dark stains on the wood. Maybe oil or animal blood. I couldn't tell. I stepped further in, and the floor creaked under me. The sound echoed strangely in that empty space. I found nothing alive, but something about the way the hay was disturbed, the way certain tools were moved, made it feel like someone had been in there recently. I closed the door tight this time and went back to the house, double-checking the locks before going to bed. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started drifting off, I'd hear faint noises, footsteps on dry grass, maybe, or the sound of metal shifting. I kept telling myself it was the wind or animals moving around. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found a small section of the fence behind the barn had been cut. The wire was pulled apart, leaving a gap big enough for a person to get through. That's when I knew someone had been trespassing. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a phone signal, and the nearest road was miles away. I had my truck, but it was old and stubborn. Sometimes it wouldn't start right away. I spent the day fixing the fence, checking every corner of the property. I found a few empty food cans near the edge of the woods that weren't mine. Whoever was coming around had been here for a while. That night, I stayed awake, sitting by the window with the lantern on the table. The wind was strong, whistling through the cracks in the walls. Around midnight, I saw movement near the barn. Just a flash of it, something dark shifting quickly across the field. I froze, staring hard, trying to see if it was a person or an animal. My chest felt tight. The barn door creaked again, opening slightly. I waited, watching, but nothing came out. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, until the wind stopped and everything went still again. When I finally went out to check the next morning, I saw clear footprints in the dirt this time. Human footprints. They led from the gap in the fence to the barn and then toward the side of the house before circling back. My heart was pounding as I followed them. Inside the barn, the smell was even worse than before. I found a pile of dirty blankets shoved behind a stack of hay bales, and beside it, a small pile of empty cans, wrappers, and old bottles. Someone had been living there, maybe for weeks. My skin crawled thinking about how close they'd been each night while I slept just a short walk away. I dragged everything out and burned it behind the barn. I didn't care about the smell or the smoke. I just wanted whoever it was to know I knew they were there. The rest of the day I spent packing my things, ready to leave first thing in the morning. But that night turned out to be the worst of all. I tried to stay awake again, but exhaustion got to me. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The floorboards groaned with each step. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I listened as the steps moved toward the door, then stopped. I could hear breathing, faint but close, just on the other side. The doorknob rattled softly, then again, harder this time. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight and turned it off to stay in darkness. The sound stopped, and everything went silent. I waited, not daring to breathe, for what felt like forever. Then I heard the crunch of footsteps moving away, back toward the barn. I stayed frozen until dawn. When I finally went outside, the first thing I saw were new prints in the dirt. Deep, clear shoe marks leading from the porch to the barn. I followed them, and that's when I noticed something else. The barn door wasn't just open this time. It was ripped off its hinge, lying in the dirt. Inside, the floor was torn up, hay scattered everywhere, tools missing from the hooks on the wall. And near the back, there was a large dark patch on the ground, blood, still wet. I didn't stick around to find out what had happened. I ran back to the house, grabbed my bag, and threw it in the truck. The engine hesitated for a moment before finally roaring to life. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced back once. The barn stood there, broken open, the field behind it empty except for the faint outline of footprints that disappeared into the woods. Later, when I got back to town and told the sheriff what I'd seen, they went out there to check. They told me they found signs that someone had been squatting in the barn. Old clothes, food, tools, and what looked like butchered animal remains. They never found whoever it was, but they said it wasn't the first report like that. Other abandoned farms in the area had been broken into too. Even now, I still think about that place sometimes. About how easily someone could have been watching me the whole time without me ever knowing. About those long nights where I thought I was alone but wasn't. The worst part isn't the thought that someone was living there. It's wondering if they ever left after I did.